Step into the gilded cage of the Victorian era. Beneath the elegant chandeliers, and behind delicate lace curtains, a silent crisis was unfolding. Women, praised for their perfect composure, were drowning in a sea of unspoken grief, loneliness, and the crushing weight of societal expectations. There was no room for emotional struggle, no space for vulnerability, only the relentless pressure to maintain a flawless facade. So, they turned to a seemingly gentle remedy offered in a small bottle. Laudanum. This tincture of opium promised quiet nights and calm days, a sweet escape from a suffocating world. But this relief was a gilded poison, slowly leading to dependency and a muted existence. This is the story of the quiet desperation of Victorian women and the secret sacrifices they made to survive. Behind the velvet curtains and glowing chandeliers of Victorian England, a quiet rhythm pulsed beneath the polite laughter and soft music. It was the rhythm of breath slowing, nerves unwinding, and minds slipping into a strange, seductive calm. Far from the dark alleyways and opium dens, addiction wore lace gloves and silk gowns. It didn't shout, it whispered. It didn't scandalize, it hid politely behind perfect manners. While the world admired the grace of Victorian womanhood, countless women were silently relying on a small amber bottle filled with liquid comfort. Laudanum. In the 19th century, laudanum wasn't a secret poison. It sat openly on pharmacy shelves, praised by doctors and trusted by families. A mixture of opium and alcohol, it was prescribed as casually as we might use cough syrup today. It was hailed as a miracle cure, promising sleep to the sleepless, calm to the anxious, and relief from the pain society refused to let women speak about. And Victorian women, trapped in corsets of expectation and emotional restraint, became some of its most frequent and desperate users. Picture a typical Victorian afternoon. Sunlight filters through lace curtains as a lady sits perfectly composed on a velvet sofa. Guests arrive, tea is poured, and conversations drift from fashion to social visits. Everything is orderly, respectable. Yet, beneath that calm exterior, her heart races, her thoughts swirl. Her life feels confined, not by walls, but by endless expectations. In a world where women were taught to endure everything silently, laudanum became the unspoken answer. Doctors prescribed it for anything and everything: hysteria, headaches, menstrual pain, grief, anxiety, depression, conditions society didn't understand and didn't want to discuss. Instead of asking women what they felt, feared, or carried as a burden, Victorian society simply handed them a bottle and told them to swallow it all away, quietly. It all began so innocently: a teaspoon for sleep, a few drops for nerves, a dose recommended by a trusted doctor, with no shame or secrecy attached. At first, laudanum felt like a kindness. It wrapped the mind in warm silk, softening anxieties and easing the relentless tension of daily life. Nights became easier, social gatherings bearable, tears stayed hidden. In a society where emotional fragility was a weakness, laudanum helped women perform the role of strength. But this relief came with a steep price. Tolerance grew. The same teaspoon no longer brought peace. Another drop was needed, then another. Soon, bottles emptied faster than expected. What began as occasional comfort quietly transformed into an inescapable dependency. Women who once used laudanum only for illness now needed it just to face an ordinary day. Without it, their hands trembled, their thoughts scattered, and the carefully constructed mask of Victorian grace began to crack. Yet, even this addiction was elegant. Unlike the dramatic portrayals of drunkenness, laudanum dependency happened in private. There were no chaotic scenes in the streets, no public disgrace. A woman could host a dinner party, play the piano beautifully, and converse intelligently, all while the gentle fog of opium flowed through her veins. Some husbands knew and quietly allowed it, believing it kept their wives calm and compliant. Others never noticed at all. And many doctors, they continued to prescribe it, either unaware or unwilling to admit the depth of the dependency they were fueling. Behind every respectable household, behind every painting of a serene lady in her parlor, there might have been an invisible struggle, a quiet desperation, a bottle tucked into a drawer, hidden under handkerchiefs, wrapped in secrecy, not because addiction was condemned, but because women's suffering was ignored. For many, laudanum wasn't an act of rebellion, it was an act of survival. Victorian society demanded emotional control, moral purity, and constant composure. Women were expected to be angels in the house, patient, gentle, and unshakably calm. They weren't allowed to break down, to scream, or to say, I am overwhelmed, I am unhappy, I am suffocating. So instead, they smiled, entertained guests, and kept their households flawless. They lived inside beautifully decorated cages, and laudanum became the illusion of open air. Night after night, women would swallow a dose and drift into a heavy, dreamlike state, floating away from loneliness, marital disappointment, and unspoken trauma. The next morning, they would wake, dress in silk, and resume their perfect roles. But the tragedy wasn't just personal, it was cultural. Victorian England valued reputation and order above all else. Society saw well-dressed women and perfect manners, and believed everything was fine. No one saw that beneath the lace and jewelry, a generation of women was numbing themselves just to exist. Laudanum became an invisible thread, woven into the fabric of Victorian femininity. Poets whispered about it, writers hinted at it, and diaries quietly confessed it. The most refined women in society depended on it. Their struggles were never shouted from the rooftops. Their desperation lived in the silence that society demanded of them. As the years passed and addiction deepened, some women began to lose their spark. Their eyes dulled, their movements slowed. They were physically present, but emotionally drifting further away each day. Behind closed doors, some wept without knowing why, while others just stared at the walls, lost somewhere between waking and dreaming. They began needing laudanum not for peace, but just to feel normal again. And all the while, life outside continued its beautiful charade. Balls glittered, carriages rolled through elegant streets, and society applauded its own refinement. Inside those polished drawing rooms sat women holding teacups with steady hands, hands steadied not by strength, but by the slow, silent grip of laudanum. This story isn't just about addiction. It's a reflection of a society that chose appearance over humanity, a world that gave women luxury and status, but denied them emotional freedom. It's a story about women trying to breathe in a world that refused to let them exhale. If you could walk quietly through a Victorian mansion late at night, long after the music has faded and the polished conversations have fallen silent, you would witness a very different world. The chandeliers would be dimmed, the laughter gone. The drawing rooms, once echoing with polite voices, would now sit in a heavy stillness. And somewhere, in a softly lit bedroom, a woman would be sitting awake, her hands trembling slightly, her breath uneven, her heart restless, staring at the small glass bottle on her bedside table. Laudanum was never dramatic in its arrival. It came gently. It waited patiently, a silent promise beside lace pillows and velvet drapes. Women reached for it, not out of wild desperation, but in a moment of quiet resignation. A teaspoon, a swallow, a burn of alcohol, followed by a spreading warmth. And slowly, all the thoughts that had been running like wild horses through her mind would begin to slow, to soften, to blur. Worries dissolved. Expectations loosened their grip. The constant, exhausting demand to be perfect faded away, and in its place came an artificial peace that felt dangerously close to relief, dangerously close to freedom. Doctors had normalized it so deeply that addiction wasn't seen as addiction at all. It was just dependence, a habit, or a nervous constitution. A woman who consumed laudanum wasn't judged as weak or immoral. In fact, she was often seen as delicate, refined, and sensitive, exactly what Victorian society expected women to be. And because of that, the greatest danger of laudanum wasn't the scandal, it was the acceptance. There is something hauntingly tragic about a society where pain is not allowed to exist openly. Victorian women lived under an invisible, crushing pressure. They were expected to carry grief with elegance, heartbreak with dignity, and emotional suffering with a smile. When husbands were distant, they were to remain loyal. When loneliness struck, they were to fill their lives with quiet hobbies. When motherhood became overwhelming, they were to embrace it silently. And when their minds began to fracture under this weight, society handed them laudanum and called it help. So laudanum found its way into childbirth recovery, into postpartum depression, into the anxiety after miscarriages, and into the grief after losing a child, the pain that Victorian society simply did not know how to comfort. Women who had lived through emotional storms with no support found solace in that amber bottle when nothing else could soothe them. Some had lost babies, yet were expected to continue smiling at tea parties. Some endured loveless marriages, yet were praised for being dutiful. Some were trapped in homes where wealth existed, but affection did not. Laudanum whispered, "You don't have to feel all of this," and they listened. Night after night, as the city slept beneath a blanket of fog and the gas lamps flickered like tired eyes in the dark, Countless women lay in bed, suspended between reality and dream, floating in a quiet numbness. They weren't fully asleep, not fully awake, just drifting. Time lost its meaning. Thoughts slowed to a gentle crawl. The world softened. Tears never had the chance to fall, because emotions dissolved before they could break free. And yet, as peaceful as it felt, Laudanum was never truly kind. It took something each night, something subtle at first. A little clarity, a little brightness, a little energy, then more. Days became heavier, mornings became harder. Memory began slipping like silk through fingertips. Smiles became automatic rather than genuine. Women stopped feeling pain, yes, but slowly, they stopped feeling joy as well. Addiction rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as comfort. Months would pass, maybe years, and the gentle nightly dose became essential. Without it, the world felt too loud, too sharp, too real. The quiet, heroic strength that Victorian women had forced themselves to maintain now depended entirely on a liquid crutch. What society interpreted as a calm temperament or impressive composure was often just laudanum at work. Behind mirrors brushed with powder and rouge, behind eyes lined beautifully and lips smiling softly, many women were fading internally. Their laughter became echoes, their energy grew thin, their emotional world turned pale. They moved like beautiful ghosts inside their luxurious houses. Relationships changed too. Some husbands noticed something was different, but they didn't understand it. Their wives seemed distant, strangely detached, their thoughts drifting even in the middle of a conversation. They appeared calm, yes, almost too calm. Their emotional reactions were dulled. Their spark had dimmed. They were physically present, impeccably dressed, perfectly mannered, but emotionally, they stood somewhere far away, behind an invisible fog. Some husbands didn't mind. A subdued wife was easier to manage in a patriarchal society. Others felt confused, maybe lonely in their own way, yet lacked the emotional language to ask, "Are you okay?" Victorian masculinity didn't allow for that kind of vulnerability either, and so, silence met silence. Loneliness met loneliness. Two people shared the same house, but lived in different worlds. Women, too, gradually noticed the cage tightening around them, not the external cage of societal expectations this time, but an internal one. They realized they could no longer function without laudanum. Their bodies demanded it. Their minds craved it. Without it, the world felt unbearable. Their hands shook. Their hearts raced. Their thoughts became chaotic. Sleep refused to come. The tears returned, but now, they came from fear, not sadness. They were no longer just trapped by society. They were trapped by dependence. Imagine the weight of that realization. A woman who had once been proud, graceful, and admired, suddenly discovering that her calm was not her own anymore. That her strength came from a bottle. That her peace was borrowed. That her survival depended on something that was slowly destroying her from the inside. And yet, she couldn't ask for help. Because what would she say? "I cannot cope with the life society has forced on me. I am drowning in expectations. I am exhausted from pretending." Victorian society had no room for such confessions. So once again, silence became the only choice, and silence fed the addiction further. Meanwhile, outside these private struggles, the world continued to celebrate the manufactured beauty of Victorian femininity. Pain was hidden behind lace. Suffering was disguised with perfume. Breaking hearts were concealed beneath corsets. Nobody wanted to disturb the illusion of perfect womanhood. That was the real tragedy. Not just that women used laudanum, but that they had so few alternatives. No therapy, no emotional support networks, no language to express mental health struggles, no social acceptance of vulnerability, only expectations, only silence, only a small glass bottle promising an escape. As the years passed, laudanum was no longer just a medicine. It had become part of the emotional architecture of Victorian society, holding together the fragile structure of lives that appeared perfect on the outside but was slowly collapsing within. Some women lived entire decades like this. Some grew old like this. Some never escaped. And countless stories of their suffering disappeared quietly into history, recorded unnamed and unseen, because polite society never wrote about its own weaknesses. But behind every portrait of a serene Victorian lady, behind every graceful pose in a museum painting, there might have been a bottle, hidden just out of sight, not because she was weak, but because her world did not allow her to be human without it. While Victorian society admired itself in polished mirrors, proud of its discipline, elegance, and moral superiority. A strange irony lingered quietly in the background. The same culture that condemned public vice was silently dependent on a private addiction. Respectability mattered more than reality. Image mattered more than well-being. Women were praised for being the gentle angels of the home, but no one questioned what it cost them to appear that perfect every single day. And so, laudanum did not just belong to the anonymous, ordinary women of Victorian streets and suburbs. It also lived in grand estates, royal palaces, and literary circles. Some of the most celebrated women of the era, the ones whose names survived in books and journals, also knew the taste of laudanum all too well. Writers, poets, artists, society ladieswomen who were intelligent, creative, and deeply emotional in a world that allowed them only limited space to express themselves. One of the most haunting realities of the Victorian era is how many of these celebrated women turned to laudanum not because they were weak, but because they were deeply feeling human beings in a society that punished emotion. Women who felt too much, questioned too much, or thought too deeply often found themselves crushed beneath the weight of expectations. Laudanum offered them a brief doorway away from overwhelming thought, a moment of silence in a mind full of storms. The literary world saw this clearly. Victorian literature is filled with subtle references to laudanum, opium, and emotional numbness. Not loud warnings or public scandals, but quiet acknowledgments. Writers knew, they observed, they saw the truth hidden behind silk curtains and decorative smiles. Some women wrote secretly about it in diaries that would only be discovered long after their deaths. Pages inked with confessions no one of their time was allowed to hear. Words like, "I cannot sleep without it. My nerves will not calm unless I take my drops. I do not know who I am anymore without the medicine." These were not dramatic exaggerations. They were slow cries for help, written in private, whispered onto paper, because society gave them no other place to speak. Meanwhile, doctors continued prescribing laudanum like a solution to everything. A restless night, laudanum. Emotional distress, laudanum. A woman overwhelmed by her life, laudanum. Victorian medicine often failed to understand women's health beyond stereotypes. Women were frequently diagnosed with vague conditions like nervous complaints or female hysteria. Instead of seeking causes, doctors dulled symptoms. Instead of asking why women were suffering, society taught them to endure quietly. Instead of offering understanding, it offered sedation. And slowly, laudanum became not just a drug, but an institution, a tradition. A silent companion passed from one generation of women to another. Daughters saw their mothers relying on it. Young women watched older women sip from the mysterious medicine bottle. Girls grew up learning that when life becomes overwhelming, when emotions rise, when sorrow becomes too heavy to carry, the answer was not to speak, not to question, not to rebel, but to numb. And that may be the saddest inheritance of all. Imagine a small Victorian girl growing up in a grand home. She sees her mother as graceful, elegant, admired by society. She sees perfect dinners, flawless social events, a home glowing with refinement. But she also sees her mother retreat sometimes to her room, closing the door gently behind her. She sees the shadows under her eyes. She hears faint weeping through the walls. She notices the little bottle always nearby. She doesn't understand at first, but she learns. She learns that being a woman means smiling no matter what. That strength means silence. That dignity means never complaining. That pain must be hidden. And laudanum becomes part of that lesson. As these girls grew, they stepped into the same expectations their mothers once carried. They married into lives chosen for them. They slipped into roles designed long before they were born. And when the weight became too much, when loneliness crept in, when exhaustion settled deep in their bones, they reached for the same solution. Because that is what Victorian society did best. It repeated itself. Behind every wealthy lady sipping tea at a social gathering may have been years of emotional exhaustion. Behind every dutiful wife hosting a polished dinner party may have been a sleepless night survived only through laudanum. Behind every seemingly perfect household was a reality too fragile to be spoken aloud. Some women did try to stop. They recognized the slow danger creeping into their lives. They felt their minds slipping, their clarity fading, their dependency tightening like a silk ribbon tied too tightly around their lungs. They attempted to break free, to reduce their doses, to endure without it. But the withdrawals were cruel. Restlessness, sweating, shaking, insomnia, a mind suddenly attacked by thoughts it had been shielded from for years. Without laudanum, they didn't just feel discomfort. They felt the full weight of every suppressed emotion rushing back at once. Guilt they never dealt with, grief they never processed, loneliness they never acknowledged. Years of emotional suppression flooded back like a storm breaking through a dam, and without emotional support, without understanding, without society allowing them to be vulnerable, many women went back to the only thing that made the storm quiet again. So addiction won, quietly, gracefully, tragically. No newspapers wrote about it. There were no dramatic public scandals, no outraged speeches, because respectable addiction is the easiest addiction to ignore. Victorian society continued to function. Parties continued, balls glittered, empires expanded, and tucked into that proud era of industrial growth and cultural refinement lived a silent contradiction. The women who held homes together, the women society praised as moral anchors, were slowly disappearing inside their own numbness. It wasn't just a health crisis, it was a human tragedy, a tragedy born not from individual weakness, but from a society that refused to listen. Society didn't see addicts, it saw perfect wives, perfect mothers, perfect daughters, but perfection was a mask soaked in laudanum, and when a civilization demands perfection, it must also accept the price. In the end, laudanum became both a symbol of Victorian brilliance and Victorian failure. It revealed the beauty of the era's surface and the pain buried beneath it. It exposed the cost of demanding quiet suffering instead of allowing honest vulnerability. Behind every elegant Victorian drawing room, behind every shimmering chandelier, behind every beautifully dressed lady with flawless manners, there may have been a quiet, trembling soul, fighting battles no one allowed her to speak about, finding comfort in the only place society permitted, a small bottle of liquid silence. As the Victorian era marched on, society painted itself as a masterpiece of discipline, morality, and refinement. The world saw grand mansions, glittering banquets, and perfectly mannered families, but beneath this polished surface, invisible cracks were widening. Inside many of those elegant homes, quiet tragedies unfolded, gently and silently, like candle flames fading one breath at a time. Laudanum, once just a medicine tucked into drawers, had become a hidden force, shaping relationships, emotions, and destinies. Behind the closed doors of drawing rooms, marriages began to change in ways no one dared to discuss. Imagine a husband sitting across from his wife at dinner. He watches her speak softly, respond politely, and smile with perfect grace. Yet, he feels an unexplainable distance between them. Her eyes look the same, but something inside them has dimmed. Her laughter sounds pleasant, but it lacks the warmth it once held. She is there, physically present, immaculate as always, but emotionally, she is somewhere far away, moving through life like a shadow. At first, many husbands failed to understand. Victorian men were not raised to analyze emotions. They valued order, routine, and a smoothly run household above all else. Their wives were calm, their homes were peaceful. There were no dramatic arguments, no chaos, no disobedience. From the outside, it looked like marital success. But emotional distance doesn't always scream. Sometimes, it simply grows like ivy, quietly covering the walls of connection until nothing familiar remains. Laudanum did that. It smoothed away pain so effectively that it smoothed away passion. It erased anxiety, but often erased joy along with it. It calmed the heart, but it also muted love. Husbands began to sense an emptiness creeping into their relationships, silence born not of comfort, but of deep, unseen separation. Their wives didn't argue or cry or protest, but they also stopped truly engaging. Conversations grew shorter, affection became mechanical, their emotional presence simply faded away. This is one of the most tragic aspects of laudanum dependency. It didn't destroy loudly, it erased quietly. Children, too, felt this change in ways they couldn't explain. A child might be playing on the floor, glancing up at their mother seated in a beautiful chair, her hands folded delicately, her posture perfect, yet her gaze distant. She would smile, speak gently, maybe brush a hand across their hair. But the warmth of genuine attention, the spark that makes a child feel truly seen, was flickering faintly. A child doesn't have the words for emotional absence, but their heart feels it deeply. Many children grew up with mothers who loved them, but were slowly drifting behind laudanum's veil. These weren't neglectful villains. They were women slipping away in silence, held by a dependency society never taught them to fight. And then there were the darker outcomes. Because laudanum, like any addictive substance, doesn't respect social class, wealth, or a moral image. Dependence tightens its grip over time, turning a nightly comfort into a daily need, turning graceful composure into quiet deterioration. Some women began to lose control. A spoonful became two, drops became gulps. Nights of escape turned into days of numbness. Their minds slowed, their bodies weakened, their health declined. If you look closely at Victorian death records, they tell a story society never admitted publicly. Behind phrases like nervous collapse, exhaustion, female weakness, or sudden illness, the whispers of history tell of accidental overdoses and lives lost quietly behind bedroom curtains. Some women simply passed away in their sleep, their hearts slowing under the weight of a drug that once promised peace. Their families mourned respectably, society sent condolences, but the truth rarely traveled beyond private whispers. Yet, the tragedy wasn't only in the lives that ended, it was also in the lives that continued, half awake, half lost, half living. Women who once had dreams, intellectual sparks, and passions for art, music, or conversation, gradually surrendered those vibrant parts of themselves. They became silent companions to their own numbness, existing but not fully alive. They attended dinners, smiled in photographs, and upheld their roles. But internally, their world had faded to muted colors, and society applauded them for it. A calm woman was considered admirable. A quiet woman was praised. A compliant, undemanding, emotionally subdued wife was seen as the ideal. Victorian values rewarded the very state that Laudanum created. So instead of sounding alarms at this emotional numbness, society celebrated it. Instead of questioning why women were fading, it praised them for being so well behaved. The hypocrisy is breathtaking. Victorian values preached morality and virtue while ignoring immense suffering. They glorified feminine gentleness while suppressing feminine humanity. Of course, some women became painfully aware of the cage closing around them. They felt themselves slipping, their identities dissolving, their inner voices becoming faint echoes. A part of them screamed silently for help, desperate to break free from the drug, from expectations, from the emotional isolation. But where could they go? Who could they tell? If they confessed their dependence, society wouldn't have understood the pain that led them there. It would have simply whispered in judgment. If they revealed their emotional suffering, they'd be labeled weak, dramatic, or hysterical. And if they tried to stop on their own, they faced physical torment and mental storms without any support. Ironically, it was often their doctors who had started them on laudanum in the first place. So many women were trapped, knowing they were losing themselves but unable to admit it. They cried quietly in private. They wrote late-night diary entries begging for relief. And then, as fear, pain, or sleeplessness overwhelmed them, they reached for the very bottle they longed to escape. That is the heartbreaking paradox of addiction. The thing destroying you becomes the only thing that makes life bearable while it destroys you. Meanwhile, the world outside marched on. Men debated politics, explored science, built railways, and expanded empires. History books recorded their achievements and triumphs. But few pages document the silent battlefield inside drawing rooms, where women fought emotional wars all alone. Victorian England built cathedrals, museums, and factories, but it failed to build safe spaces for women's emotions. The true cost of Victorian perfection was paid quietly, by women whose struggles never made the headlines. They carried the weight of maintaining family dignity while sacrificing their own mental peace. They upheld society's moral image while their own hearts fractured in silence. Laudanum didn't ruin Victorian women. It revealed how deeply Victorian society had already failed them by refusing to let them feel openly, by denying them emotional expression, by turning their pain into shame, and by replacing support with sedation. So when we imagine those Victorian drawing rooms today, shimmering with elegance and whispered conversation, we must remember the unseen reality. Behind the silk gowns and polished manners were women holding themselves together with fragile strength and liquid silence. Women who looked perfect but were quietly unraveling. Their lives teach us something powerful. When a society demands silence instead of understanding, when it values image over humanity, and when it forces people to hide their pain instead of healing it, addiction doesn't appear as rebellion, it appears as survival. And in Victorian drawing rooms, survival often tasted like laudanum. As the Victorian era marched on, a strange paradox took hold. On the outside, society grew brighter, busier, and louder. Railways sliced through landscapes, factories roared with new machines, and grand exhibitions celebrated human achievement. But while the world saw progress everywhere, it didn't reach every human heart equally. Men gained power, movement, and ambition. Women gained expectations, responsibilities, and silence. And into that silence, laudanum flowed like a dark, quiet river beneath polite civilization. Inside elegant homes, grief settled like dust unnoticed and rarely discussed. Victorian life was incredibly fragile. Child mortality was heartbreakingly common. Illnesses could strike without any warning. Mothers lost babies, sometimes more than one, and were expected to cry politely, grieve gracefully, then resume their duties with composed dignity. A mother could bury a child in the morning and pour tea for guests that same afternoon, because society demanded strength without visible sorrow. But grief doesn't just disappear because society refuses to look at it. So many mothers carried wounds that never healed. They hid them beneath tight corsets and delicate lace, under perfectly braided hair and subtle perfume. And when the pain kept them awake, when their hearts felt too heavy to carry, doctors meaning well but understanding little offered laudanum as a solution. Just a few drops. They'd say, "This will help your nerves. This will make it easier." But those drops didn't erase the pain. They buried it alive. Some women began using laudanum as a form of memory protection, shielding themselves from thoughts too painful to relive. A child's empty bed, a name never spoken again, a lullaby echoing in silence. Society wanted them to move on, and laudanum helped them appear as though they had. But deep inside, their hearts were quietly dissolving. Then there were the women trapped, not by grief, but by marriages that offered no affection. Arranged marriages, marriages for status, marriages built on cold expectation rather than love. A wife could sleep beside a man who didn't truly see her, who didn't listen or understand. She was expected to obey him, respect him, and remain forever loyal no matter how lonely she felt. Imagine living day after day in a house full of luxury, but starved of warmth. A grand mansion can feel like a prison if the heart inside it is left unattended. Women decorated with jewels still felt invisible. Women in beautiful silk gowns still cried alone. Society admired these marriages from the outside, while refusing to acknowledge the emotional starvation happening within. Laudanum became the quiet companion of these lonely wives, not because they wanted to escape life, but because they desperately wanted to numb it, just enough to endure it. Even passion, creativity, and intelligence were quietly punished in women. A woman who thought too deeply, wrote too honestly, questioned too boldly, or felt too intensely, was often labeled as dramatic, unstable, or overly emotional. Society wanted women to be calm, controlled, and predictable. Ironically, laudanum helped create the very emotional stillness society valued, while destroying the spark that made these women vibrant. Some of the brightest female minds of the era dimmed under its influence. There were women who once wrote poetry with fire in their words, whose pens slowed, whose sentences drifted, whose creativity drowned in a fog. Musicians who once played with passion began playing softly, mechanically, without emotional depth. Artists who once painted feelings now painted only shapes. Socially admired women became emotionally invisible. There's something deeply heartbreaking about watching strength slowly dissolve, not because it was absent, but because society refused to allow it to exist freely. In private, fragile moments when they were truly alone, these women sometimes felt a flash of realization, a sudden, painful awareness that they were losing themselves, that years were passing in a haze, that their memories were fading at the edges, that their true feelings, buried under laudanum's calm, were suffocating. But awareness doesn't always bring freedom. Sometimes it brings deeper despair. Because where could they go with this realization? They couldn't cry out, they couldn't confess, they couldn't rebel. Victorian society loved gentle sadness, not honest pain. It admired controlled melancholy, not raw emotional reality. A woman collapsing emotionally was a scandal. A woman numbing herself silently was considered graceful. So many women built their entire lives around pretending to be fine. Time, however, has a way of revealing what silence tries to hide. As dependency deepened, the women began to change physically. Their health weakened, their skin paled, their energy faded, their once bright presence became fragile. They convinced themselves they were just delicate, weak of nerves, or sensitive, because those were the words society had always given them. They didn't see it as addiction. They saw it as their personality. Imagine the cruelty of that, to lose pieces of yourself and believe it is simply who you are meant to be. Families noticed the changes, but politely ignored them. Servants whispered behind closed doors. Neighbors noticed different behavior, but as long as a family's reputation remained intact, no one interfered. The silence continued, protecting the illusion of a perfect society, while slowly suffocating the women inside it. And even when addiction became dangerously severe, when women hovered on the edge of collapse, society rarely asked the right questions. Not, what happened to her heart, or what has she carried alone? Instead, they'd say, she must have been fragile, or she was always too emotional. Victorian society blamed women for the very wounds it helped create. And yet, through all of this, women tried desperately to live, to be mothers, wives, hostesses, and gentle figures of respect. They dressed beautifully, maintained homes, raised children, and performed elegance every single day, all while slowly drowning within themselves. They showed strength in the only way society allowed them to, silently. There is a haunting dignity in that, but dignity doesn't cancel out tragedy. Behind every graceful portrait of a Victorian lady lies a possibility that she was living two lives, the life the world saw controlled, polite, elegant, and admirable, and the life hidden inside, aching, numb, fading, and just trying to survive. The world applauded one and never acknowledged the other, and so, as history wrote about inventions, wars, politics, and empires, the silent suffering of thousands of women simply dissolved into forgotten air. Their stories weren't carved into monuments, their battles weren't listed in textbooks, their emotional endurance never earned applause, but that doesn't mean it didn't exist. It lived in the quiet nighttime breaths of women lying awake, in the trembling hands reaching for a small bottle, in the heavy hearts beating beneath silk gowns. Laudanum was not merely a drug of its time, it was a mirror that reflected a society proud of its progress, yet blind to its emotional cruelty. A world where women wore beauty like armor, while their souls whispered for relief. A civilization powerful enough to shape empires, but too afraid to face the fragile humanity of the women within it. Victorian society had built itself beautifully, but beauty built on silence always comes with a cost, and countless women paid it quietly. In the quiet, orderly world of a respectable Victorian home, the day began with a predictable rhythm. Servants lighting fires, the soft clink of china, the distant sound of horses on stone streets, and somewhere in that morning calm, often hidden behind a lace curtain or inside a private dressing room, a small bottle rested. It wasn't a dramatic symbol or a forbidden item. It was ordinary, accepted, and strangely trusted. The story of laudanum in Victorian society isn't just about bottles and dosages. It's about the very rhythm of daily life, about households where everything appeared perfect on the surface, while something quietly shifted underneath. For so many Victorian women, laudanum didn't begin as a vice. It began as medicine. It was something recommended, prescribed by a confident-looking doctor who spoke in calm, reassuring tones. You have to remember, Victorian medicine was still evolving, still deeply influenced by old beliefs and very limited scientific understanding. Pain was a mystery. Female health was profoundly misunderstood, and emotional suffering, that was almost never acknowledged openly. So laudanum, a powerful tincture of opium mixed with alcohol, wasn't presented as a danger, but as a relief. It was prescribed for headaches, nerves, sleeplessness, menstrual pain, grief, exhaustion, even just ordinary sadness. It promised quiet, rest, and calm in a world where the expectations on women never, ever rested. In respectable households, it became a staple in the medical cabinet, placed right beside harmless remedies, treated like a simple solution for incredibly complicated emotions, and slowly, almost gently, it began to shape their lives. As the day moved on, the Victorian household carried on with its routines. There were social visits to make, the household to manage, letters to be written, children to be guided, and always, the endless expectation of dignified composure. Women were expected to remain balanced and graceful, to be elegant even in their suffering, to endure without showing a single crack in their facade. And for those struggling beneath that immense weight, laudanum felt like a small mercy. A few drops could soften the hard edges of reality. It quieted racing thoughts. It blurred emotional pain just enough to make the day manageable. It allowed them to remain composed in drawing rooms, to be generous at social gatherings, and polite during long, draining conversations. To any outside observer, these women appeared perfectly controlled, dignified, and serene. Inside, however, something subtle was beginning to change. Dependence rarely happened suddenly. It crept in quietly, over weeks, months, and sometimes years. A dose taken occasionally for a headache became a dose taken regularly to face the day. Relief slowly transformed into reliance. The very feeling of normalcy started to feel connected not to their own natural strength, but to the presence of laudanum. And because Victorian society demanded emotional restraint, many women never spoke openly about their growing dependence. There was no dramatic confession, no loud admission of a problem. There was just continued, dignified silence. Even husbands often didn't fully understand what was happening. They might notice their wife's fatigue or her increasing fragility, but society had already told them that women were naturally delicate, naturally emotional, naturally frail. So instead of alarm, there was acceptance. Instead of a warning, there was a quiet reassurance that this was simply how women were. This image of the delicate woman was romanticized everywhere in literature, poetry, and art. Poems spoke of fainting heroines and fragile beauties, of sorrowful souls draped in elegance. In some circles, illness and sensitivity were even considered refined, desirable traits. Within this cultural mindset, laudanum use seemed to fit perfectly. It didn't clash with expectations. It quietly helped women meet them. No one questioned too deeply why so many women seemed exhausted, or why so many needed an artificial calm just to function. They were simply expected to remain beautiful, controlled, and softly suffering. Society didn't ask what it cost to maintain that image. Meanwhile, doctors continued to prescribe laudanum with absolute confidence. Medical advertisements in newspapers and magazines casually promoted it as a cure. Pharmacies displayed it openly on their shelves. There were no bold warning labels, no public health campaigns against addiction. Most people didn't even have the language to describe dependence as we understand it today. Addiction wasn't seen as a medical condition needing careful treatment. It was often viewed as a moral failing, a sign of personal weakness. And here lies the heartbreaking irony. The very people who were encouraged to use laudanum by their doctors and their culture were later silently judged for relying on it. When their tolerance increased and they needed higher doses, the blame rarely fell on the drug itself. Instead, society quietly assumed weakness, emotional instability, or some kind of personal failing on the woman's part. Inside the elegant drawing rooms of Victorian homes, the conversations continued as if nothing was wrong. Guests arrived, laughter floated through the candlelit air, music played softly from a piano in the corner. Women smiled with perfect composure, their posture immaculate. Yet behind that flawless performance, many were managing their existence with measured drops from a small bottle hidden away in a nearby drawer. They weren't rebels or thrill-seekers. They were simply trying to remain functional in a world that allowed them almost no emotional freedom. This quiet desperation was never chaotic. It was calm, controlled, and almost completely invisible. As evening approached and the world grew quieter, the effects of laudanum often shaped the night. For some, sleep became entirely dependent on it. Without it, the nights were long, restless, and filled with a kind of anxiety and dark thoughts they were never permitted to express during the day. With it, sleep came gently, dreamlike, wrapped in a soft, chemical haze. But even their rest was no longer natural. It was guided by a substance. The boundary between choice and necessity had completely blurred, and so another day ended, appearing graceful and perfect on the surface, but silently managed from beneath. Generation after generation, this pattern formed a quiet, unwritten chapter of Victorian life. It didn't appear in official speeches or shape grand political events. It rarely erupted in scandalous headlines. Instead, it rested silently within the home, within the drawing room, within a carefully preserved and suffocating elegance. It was an unseen thread woven deep into the fabric of society. In the end, laudanum wasn't just a substance. It became a symbol of an entire era. An era of repression, of impossible expectations wrapped in beauty, of an emotional silence hidden behind a veneer of social perfection. It represents a time when help came not through conversation, support, or emotional understanding, but through a bottle, quietly accepted as the only available solution. The women who held those bottles were not reckless or foolish. They were ordinary people living under extraordinary pressure, using what their world, their doctors, and their culture told them was safe. This was the quiet desperation of the Victorian drawing room. Lives that appeared serene yet depended on invisible support. Emotions that were never permitted to speak yet were constantly soothed into silence, and a society that admired perfection without ever asking the true cost required to maintain it. In the grand estates of Victorian England, a quiet story was unfolding. one written not in public scandals but in whispered fears and hidden dependencies. While the world outside buzzed with progress, inside the drawing rooms, the soft clatter of teacups often masked a silent tension. Women, adorned in lace and silk, moved with flawless grace, their manners impeccable. But beneath this polished surface, a secret accomplice named Laudanum was at work, keeping nerves calm and hearts from breaking. This was a generation of women trained to endure without complaint. They were praised for their patience and admired for their composure. But this praise came at an invisible cost, measured in sleepless nights and trembling hands. Mothers were expected to nurture endlessly, wives to manage households with unwavering grace, all while suppressing their own fears and disappointments. Laudanum became a bridge between suffocation and survival. It wasn't a rebellion, it was a tool, a mechanism for endurance in a world that offered no emotional release. For many, taking it was a private ritual, a carefully measured teaspoon of the amber liquid, a slow warmth spreading through the body, quieting a racing pulse. One swallow could transform anxiety into calm, grief into forgetfulness. But with this temporary peace came the slow erosion of self. What started as occasional relief soon became a quiet dependency. A few drops after a stressful day turned into a nightly necessity. The body adapted, tolerance grew, and more was needed. A teaspoon became a tablespoon. Soon, nights were reliant on it, and mornings were a struggle through its hazy aftereffects. The fog of this chemical calm began to blur the lines between natural strength and induced stability. Women started to measure their resilience, not by their inner fortitude, but by their ability to function with Laudanum's help. This subtle dependency altered the very fabric of Victorian life. A mother on Laudanum could still appear attentive, but the spontaneous warmth her children needed began to fade. A wife could still host guests flawlessly, but the spark of intimate connection with her husband might dim. Society applauded the seamless exterior, but the internal world of these women was becoming a landscape of muted emotions and quiet survival. The psychological weight was immense. The first thought upon waking was often, "Will I have enough to get through the day?" Each dose was a moment of relief, but also a quiet surrender. This wasn't the chaotic addiction often portrayed in sensational novels. It was quiet, contained, and socially invisible. In a society that celebrated emotional control, this invisibility was both a shield and a trap. As tolerance increased, the emotional consequences deepened. The world itself started to feel less vibrant. Joy lost its color, curiosity dimmed, and spontaneous laughter became a distant memory. Women who were once intellectually sharp or creatively inspired found their inner worlds shrinking, their passions dulled. Their identities became tangled with the very substance that offered them refuge. When we look back at history, it's easy to miss this subtle tragedy. Portraits immortalize Victorian women as icons of elegance, poised gracefully in polished drawing rooms. But within those same households, countless women were fighting invisible battles. Their struggles weren't dramatic. They were internal and unacknowledged. Yet, these quiet battles shaped entire lives, influencing choices, relationships, and the very nature of domestic reality. Every social interaction carried the weight of this hidden dependency. Hosting a dinner party, attending church, or visiting friends required a performance of outward calm. Behind every measured smile and gentle word, many women were carefully managing internal turmoil, often with Laudanum's assistance. The effort to maintain this flawless appearance was a full-time job, consuming mental and emotional energy. Children growing up in these homes could often sense an invisible distance. A mother's affection was present, but seemed filtered. They didn't experience neglect, but the quiet consequences of a parent's survival strategy shaped their understanding of intimacy and care in subtle, lasting ways. Dependency also created secret communities among women. Friends and sisters might share knowledge of Laudanum discreetly, offering advice on dosages or cautioning against overuse. In a world where emotional honesty was constrained, these shared understandings formed unspoken networks of support. They understood each other in ways men, doctors, and society at large could not. But even these networks were hidden, shrouded in secrecy to preserve the veneer of propriety. This duality of public grace and private reliance defined much of the Victorian female experience. They navigated these two worlds with remarkable precision, a daily balancing act that went unrecognized by almost everyone around them. The tragedy isn't that they took Laudanum, but that society created conditions where it felt necessary for survival. They didn't choose this path out of whim. They chose it because the system offered no other. The cost dependency, muted joy, and internal estrangement was invisible, but it shaped families and social structures from the inside out. The elegance we celebrate in history was inseparable from the hidden suffering that made it possible. Late in the evening, after the drawing rooms had emptied, many women would return to their private spaces. They'd measure the small dose that would grant them sleep, consuming it in a quiet ritual. In that moment, there was no scandal, no drama, only the deep, human need for relief. And as they drifted off, the world continued on, blissfully unaware of the silent compromises that upheld its serene facade. Laudanum was more than a drug. It was a testament to the immense pressures and silences that defined Victorian womanhood. It was a chemical mirror reflecting a society's failure to value and support emotional reality. And in every small, quiet swallow, it carried the immense weight of survival, secrecy, and the hidden cost of perfection. The streets of Victorian England, lit by the soft, flickering glow of gas lamps, seemed to whisper tales of progress and order. But behind the grand facades of London's most elegant homes, a different story was unfolding. In drawing rooms gleaming with polished wood and crystal chandeliers, a deceptive calm reigned. But upstairs, in the private quiet of the bedroom, the invisible struggles of women continued. For countless women, the day was marked by familiar rituals, morning letters, afternoon tea, and a small amber-colored bottle of laudanum. This wasn't a choice of indulgence or luxury. For many, it was an act of survival. It was the only way to endure the relentless pressure of a society that demanded perfection but offered no emotional sanctuary. The expectation was to be graceful, composed, and serene, no matter the inner turmoil. So, they learned to manage a delicate balance. They appeared poised and elegant in public, while privately surrendering their emotional autonomy to chemistry. The nightly dose became a familiar rhythm, a quiet companion that soothed the anxious mind even as it created a deep, unbreakable dependence. With each swallow, a deceptive warmth would spread, dulling persistent grief, quieting anxieties, and creating a sense of calm that was both a welcome relief and terrifying in its artificiality. The relief was immediate, but the cost was paid slowly, over time. The nights became peaceful, but the days grew less vibrant. Emotions started to dull, passions faded into the background, and even cherished memories began to soften at the edges. The mind's natural clarity, once so sharp and full of life, became hazy, as if viewed through a permanent fog. At first, the changes were subtle. A misplaced word in conversation, a moment of emotional detachment from their own children, a less engaged presence at social gatherings. Women would reassure themselves that it was only temporary, that the dose was carefully controlled. After all, society demanded composure above all else. But slowly, the awareness began to dawn. This was no longer a choice. It was a dependence, a psychological reliance so deeply intertwined with daily life that their very identity felt tied to that little amber bottle. And the medical establishment only reinforced this cycle. Doctors prescribed laudanum for everything from insomnia and nervousness to the vague catch-all diagnosis of female hysteria. It was considered a legitimate medical aid, and its use carried no social stigma. In fact, a reliance on laudanum was sometimes seen as a sign of a refined and sensitive nature. It was a profound paradox. The very tool that created dependency was praised as a mark of virtue. Women were trapped in a quiet, invisible cycle. The drug helped them maintain their public persona, but it was slowly, steadily eroding their private selves. This silent toll began to echo through their relationships. Husbands, often wrapped up in their own societal roles, rarely saw the full extent of their wives' struggles. They saw a calm, composed partner who managed the home, family, and social obligations with what looked like effortless ease. Children experienced a kind of measured warmth, their mother's affection softened and muted by chemical moderation. Laughter no longer bubbled up spontaneously. Passion was quieted. Curiosity and joy were replaced by a carefully constructed, unshakable calm. This was especially tragic for women who once held intellectual or creative ambitions. Writers who had once penned sharp, vivid prose now found it impossible to concentrate. Artists discovered their vision had become muted, their inspiration dulled. Musicians could still perform with technical skill, but the spark, the soul that once defined their art, was gone. Emotional expression, a fundamental part of being human, was now chemically managed. Society praised the elegance and composure, but never once counted the emotional cost. This created a profound sense of isolation. Women were trapped. They needed laudanum to navigate the demands of their daily lives, yet each dose reinforced their withdrawal from reality, from genuine connection, from their own authentic emotions. Moments of true presence became rarer. Conversations flowed, smiles appeared, and all the gestures were graceful. But the essence of the self often felt distant, hidden behind a fog of quiet sedation. Some women recognized the danger. They tried to fight back, to reduce their dosage, to reclaim their clarity and spontaneity. But withdrawal was a cruel punishment. The anxiety returned with a vengeance. The sleepless nights became unbearable. Thoughts and feelings that had been suppressed for so long resurfaced in a torrent. The body, now accustomed to the chemical support, rebelled. Many returned to laudanum, not for pleasure, but simply to survive the withdrawal. The cycle was relentless, silent, and socially invisible. The entire household felt the subtle shifts. Children sensed a gap in their mother's emotional responsiveness. Husbands, constrained by their own expectations, often misinterpreted this calm detachment as a virtue rather than a symptom. Friends and relatives, bound by the strict rules of decorum, could only offer support in whispers or coded language. True communication was stifled, and the cycle of silent struggle continued, generation after generation. Laudanum didn't just sedate, it reshaped perception. It filtered experiences, dampened grief, and altered emotional responses. It allowed women to function, to perform, and to survive, but at a cost that was almost never spoken of. Over time, subtle personality shifts accumulated. Energy dimmed, optimism faded, and their engagement with life softened. The women who appeared the most composed, the most graceful, were often the ones whose inner lives were the most constrained, their vitality surrendered to a chemical aid. Yet, even in the midst of this quiet struggle, these women displayed a remarkable resilience. They ran households, raised children, hosted society events, and performed the endless, demanding rituals of Victorian life. They upheld an image of beauty, order, and social grace, all while navigating their own internal chaos. This quiet strength, so often unrecognized, was extraordinary. The world saw perfection. Only the women themselves understood the true cost, the constant, draining management of their dependency, and the private surrender of their emotional freedom. Even death itself held a quiet tragedy. Some women succumbed to overuse, their bodies weakened by years of chemical reliance. Others simply aged with a diminished vitality, their later years shaded by fatigue, memory loss, and a subtle mental decline. Their public appearances remained polished, but the private toll endured silently. Right until the very end, Victorian society would mourn with all the proper decorum, but it never recorded the true, intimate cost. It never acknowledged the psychological sacrifices made in the name of survival. And so, laudanum remained both a companion and a captor. It was a tool for enduring a world that demanded impossible composure, but it was also a constant reminder that survival often required surrender. Victorian women walked this delicate line every single day, present, admired, and composed on the outside, dependent, fatigued, and quietly struggling on the inside. Their lives were a testament to both human resilience and the subtle cruelty of social expectation. In the quiet moments, when no one was watching, they could see the paradox that defined their existence. The very thing that allowed them to endure was also the thing that diminished them. And yet, they persevered. They survived. They maintained the image the world demanded, hiding a universe of quiet suffering and incredible strength just beneath the surface. In the quiet, elegant drawing rooms of Victorian England, time seemed to stand still. While the world outside pulsed with the rhythm of industry and empire, life inside was a delicate dance of routine, ritual, and the soft, constant ticking of clocks. Women moved through these spaces with a practiced grace, their lives seemingly as polished as the mirrors on the walls. But behind the lace collars and composed smiles, another story was unfolding, one of dependency, private despair, and the silent management of internal chaos. The architect of this quiet struggle was often a small, amber-colored bottle of laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol. It was the go-to remedy for everything from a headache to female hysteria. Its use wasn't sensational or dramatic. It was a slow, creeping presence that gradually reshaped both mind and body, with devastating cumulative effects. Physically, the toll was insidious. Long-term use weakened the digestive system, blurred the senses, and stole a person's energy. Sleep, though chemically induced, offered no real rest. Mornings were heavy, movements became slow, and hands would tremble with a fatigue that small tasks couldn't explain. Many women suffered from persistent nausea or digestive distress, but these symptoms were often brushed aside by doctors as mere female delicacy or a case of weak nerves. Their bodies, so graceful on the surface, were quietly betraying an internal strain, like a shadow beneath a polished floor. Mentally, the effects were just as profound. The crisp clarity of thought began to soften. Attention would drift. Emotions that were once sharp and vibrant became muted, as if a fog had settled over memory and imagination. Women would find gaps in their recollection of conversations or recent events. The creative spark, that flash of originality and emotional resonance in art or music, began to fade. The rich, intricate inner world of the self became filtered, partial, and mediated by chemistry. This led to a silent, creeping isolation. A woman could be present at every dinner party and charity event, yet feel an ever-widening gulf between herself and others. Conversations were polite but hollow. Laughter was controlled. Gestures were graceful but restrained. Their own children could sense a distance they couldn't name. Husbands, often interpreting this placid composure as contentment, remained oblivious to the deep emotional shift happening beside them. Even when friends offered discreet advice, the rigid rules of society prevented any open acknowledgement of dependency or suffering. Loneliness became a constant companion, even in a crowded room. The psychological toll was immense. During periods of lower dosage or attempts to quit, anxiety and depression would return with a vengeance. Women wrestled with guilt for relying on this chemical crutch, and a deep shame for losing control over their own minds. They lived in fear of judgment from a society that demanded perfection but offered no real understanding. The mind knew it was trapped, and this awareness only deepened the emotional burden. There were no heroic escapes, no sudden breaks for freedom. Life simply continued, measured in small swallows of amber liquid, in polite conversation, in the quiet management of the self. And yet, through it all, a remarkable resilience persisted. These women continued to run households, raise children, and perform the intricate emotional labor expected of them. Their public image remained flawless, even impressive. They were admired for their grace and composure, a bitter irony, as the very qualities society celebrated were being propped up by the substance that was slowly diminishing their vitality. Every compliment was a subtle reinforcement of the cycle. Inevitably, health crises would strike. A sudden collapse at a party, a prolonged illness, a rapid decline in strength. These episodes were always attributed to nervous weakness or a delicate constitution, never to chemical dependence. Many women faded away quietly over months or years, their deaths recorded in restrained, socially appropriate terms that never mentioned the silent role laudanum had played in eroding their lives. Those who survived into old age carried the permanent marks of their journey: weakened bodies, dulled emotional responses, and gaps in their memory. Their lives had been prolonged, but the richness, spontaneity, and autonomy had been stripped away. The deepest cost was emotional. Women who once felt passion, joy, or intellectual fire now experienced life through a chemical filter. Love was expressed with caution, maternal care was softened, and curiosity was dulled. Survival had become the guiding principle, not engagement. The personal vibrancy that defines a human life had quietly faded, preserved on the outside but eroded from within. This was also a generational story. Young girls watched their mothers, aunts, and grandmothers, observing the patterns of retreat, the quiet reliance on medicine, and the emotional restraint. They learned that survival often required compromise, and that the private battles of women were meant to be endured in silence. These lessons were internalized, perpetuating a cycle of dependency and emotional suppression across generations. Some did try to escape. They sought alternative remedies, turned to meditation, or immersed themselves in art. A few attempted to withdraw from laudanum completely, desperate to reclaim their minds. But withdrawal was brutal. The insomnia, anxiety, tremors, and overwhelming waves of grief often made life unbearable without the drug. The fight for freedom was a constant, exhausting battle, often ending in relapse. Ultimately, the story of laudanum in Victorian England isn't just a story of addiction. It's a reflection of a society that placed impossible demands on women. It demanded perfection, emotional restraint, and flawless composure, while offering no outlet for vulnerability, honest expression, or real support. Laudanum was a tool for survival in this rigid world, but it was a tool that erased the most vital parts of what it means to be human. In every polished drawing room, In every measured smile, the legacy of laudanum lingered. It was a silent companion, a quiet force that shaped identity, emotion, and survival. These women endured extraordinary pressures, and their stories, though often hidden, reveal the subtle tragedy of a society that valued appearances over human truth. As the grandeur of the Victorian era began to fade, giving way to the first hints of modernity, a quiet, hidden world remained tucked away, largely invisible to the history books. We measure progress in things we can see: railways cutting through the landscape, towering industrial achievements, the vast expanse of colonial empires, and a rigid code of public morality. But behind the closed doors of respectable homes, a private cost was being paid, silently, by countless women. These were women who, for decades, had relied on a chemical reprieve, laudanum, to navigate their lives. The consequences were subtle but profound: a dulling of creativity, a muting of emotions, fragile health, and lives meticulously structured around a delicate, chemically supported balance. Imagine the strange paradox of their existence. On one hand, they were admired by society for their composure and grace. On the other, their true selves were slowly being erased. This contradiction defined their entire lifetimes. In their later years, as they looked back, their feelings were a tangled mix of gratitude, shame, and a deep, quiet sorrow. Gratitude, because laudanum had offered them relief. It allowed them to maintain their composure, care for their families, and meet the incredibly rigid expectations placed upon them. But there was also shame. They relied on a substance that society didn't exactly condemn, but certainly didn't openly acknowledge either, creating a space for silent judgment. And then, there was the sorrow. Sorrow for the opportunities, the passions, and the deep emotional connections that had quietly slipped away in their relentless pursuit of simply surviving. Memory, for these women, was a complicated thing. It was both a comfort and a source of regret, filtered through decades of chemical mediation. They could recall moments of great joy and profound grief, but both emotions felt softened, their sharp edges worn down, reshaped by the necessity of their daily dose. Some learned the art of graceful suppression from their mothers, mastering the same measured emotional responses. Others sensed a gap, a maternal detachment, a faintly distant smile, a quiet absence, and came to see it as normal. So, the relationships they built carried both the beauty of their endurance and the hidden cost of their chemical survival. Friendships persisted, but the intimacy of a truly unfiltered emotional exchange became a rarity. Marriages endured, children were raised, and households were impeccably maintained. Yet the sheer depth of the human experience was, in many cases, quietly diminished. When historians look back at this period, the lives of these women raise some difficult questions. What is lost when a society values appearance more than authenticity? When it prioritizes calm over truth and control over emotional honesty? What is the real cost of survival when the very tools that make it possible also erode the essence of what it means to be human? Looking into the widespread use of laudanum, we find something much deeper than a simple story of addiction. We find a reflection of structural inequality, of gendered expectations, and of the subtle, crushing pressures that can define an entire social era. Victorian women weren't just users of a drug, they were navigators, skillfully charting a course through a world that demanded their emotional invisibility and rewarded only the perfect maintenance of an external facade. It's so easy to romanticize the past, to picture elegant drawing rooms filled with music and polite, witty conversation. But behind these polished surfaces were countless untold stories of resilience, quiet suffering, and adaptive survival. These women fought invisible battles every single day. Of course, not every story ended the same way. Some women did manage to escape their dependency, whether through new medical interventions, a painstaking process of gradual reduction, or sheer force of will and personal determination. But others never fully untangled themselves from the cycle. Their later years remained shadowed by that reliance and all its lingering aftereffects. The outcomes varied, but the underlying pattern of internal struggle, societal pressure, and chemical mediation remained remarkably constant across time and geography. Each woman's story was unique, yet each one reflected a broader, more universal truth. Survival within restrictive systems often requires a compromise, and sometimes that compromise comes at the cost of one's own vitality. If you listen closely, in the quiet moments of reflection, you can almost sense the incredible resilience these women embodied. They navigated a society that actively constrained emotional expression, that offered support only on the most superficial level, and that subtly but harshly judged any woman who dared to be independent, all while they maintained households, nurtured children, engaged with their communities, and fulfilled all of their expected societal roles. They did this while managing an internal turmoil that was completely invisible to the people around them. Their endurance isn't something you'll find in public records. It wasn't celebrated with accolades, and it wasn't recorded in the grand histories of the time. Yet, it shaped generations and left an indelible mark on the very texture of Victorian life. Eventually, laudanum faded from common medical practice. It was replaced by a more evolved understanding of addiction, mental health, and pharmacology. But its legacy persists as a powerful cautionary tale. It reminds us that progress, whether in science, medicine, or culture, is only truly meaningful when it's accompanied by empathy, by emotional recognition, and by genuine support for the people it's meant to serve. A society that demands composure without ever acknowledging suffering, or that values a perfect image over messy authenticity, will inevitably drive its members toward hidden coping mechanisms, whether they're chemical, psychological, or something else entirely. For us, today, these stories carry lessons that resonate far beyond the Victorian drawing room. They speak to a fundamental human need for emotional validation, for honest expression, for safe spaces where vulnerability is permitted rather than punished. They speak to the devastating consequences of systemic neglect and of cultural ideals that constrain our spirits rather than nurturing them. And they speak to the extraordinary resilience of individuals who navigate these constraints with grace, creativity, and a quiet strength, even when survival itself comes at a great personal cost. Ultimately, the tale of the laudanum-dependent Victorian woman is not just a historical curiosity. It's a profound reflection on human endurance under pressure. It's a story of survival, of compromise, and of a subtle, creeping tragedy. It's a narrative of lives that were maintained with incredible precision, dignity, and courage, yet were also quietly diminished by the very tools that enabled their persistence. As we look back, it's crucial that we recognize both their suffering and their strength. We must understand that the elegance we celebrate in history was inseparable from the private battles that made it all possible. Those polished drawing rooms, the measured laughter, the calm and composed facades, all of it was built on lives lived in dual realities. On one side, the world saw refinement, composure, and success. On the other, the women themselves navigated chemical dependence, emotional suppression, and a quiet, lonely struggle, often without any acknowledgement or support. And in recognizing this duality, we honor not only the resilience of these women, but also the truths that their society once ignored, and that history must now remember. Even today, their stories resonate, not as relics of a distant past, but as mirrors of our own ongoing human struggles. They are reminders that survival, composure, and grace often demand unseen sacrifices. The legacy of laudanum, and the lives that were shaped by it, compels us to reflect on the hidden costs of expectation, the fragility of human endurance, and the profound resilience required to navigate systems that reward external perfection while neglecting our internal well-being. In the final measure, the Victorian women who endured, who survived, and who maintained their dignity amidst a quiet dependence, left behind a story of human complexity, perseverance, and the delicate, often painful, balance between survival and self.